For me, the biggest violence is violence against women and children. If we can revisit the family and begin to restructure, also the whole movement from Henrietta's and them getting into the suburbs, did we bring the village and the township with us? Did we have an impact, or did we arrive in the suburb and pick up the suburb, extended the high walls, don't care about your neighbor? Because that is what used to also assist us in terms of dealing with issues of violence, especially in the community, is that you knew who your neighbor is, you knew your neighbor's movements. So did we bring that culture as we integrate with us, or did we leave it?
There's other types of violence that we're finding ourselves engaging with at CSVR that I just want to touch a bit here, because they are important in terms of intervention. The first one is what we are calling collective violence, where South Africans who are frustrated by a number of things, whether it's service delivery or police, or it's they're not getting the money that they want, are beginning to use violence as the language to try and be heard by the country. There's also the interpersonal violence, just besides the gender-based violence, but the interpersonal violence where it is mainly the young men who tend to be involved. So your assault, your murder, and all of those kinds of violence. And actually, the stats that has been released by the police show that almost 60% of the violent crime that we have are related to that kind of violence. Then we've got state violence, which we're doing quite a lot of work around police brutality and torture, where we're increasingly seeing a state using violence in trying to address some of the challenges that are arising in our country. I mean, I think Marikana is a very fresh example currently in our heads. And finally, I think we really need to start problematizing inequality in this country and call it structural violence, because it is one of the key drivers of the problems that we have around violence. Now, some of the themes that are emerging for us is that, first of all, interestingly, with these kinds of violence, and different from gender-based violence, is that there is this dichotomy between victims and perpetrators, that the face of the victim is the same as the face of the perpetrators. And South Africans really struggle to engage with that, because when we talk about violence, we want to blame immediately and say that perpetrators put them into jail. But most of the time, the face that we see is the face of young men who are not completely innocent victims, but also they could be perpetrators, but also victims at the same time.
I was actually recently I had quite an intense argument with a friend who grew up in Pretoria East, where the Waterkloof 4 hail from, as we know. And he was very insistent that there's very little sexual violence that happens in white middle-class Afrikaans households. The sexual right of the man within the family continues to this day. As we know, rape within marriage was only criminalized in the early 1990s. If we look at a sociologist like Diana Russell's work on victims of sexual violence in Afrikaner households, you see that she shows how male authority was elaborated and asserted through violence in the household, where men acted as petty despots, as she called them. And she finds a reflection in the paternalism that white men show towards women and children, in the paternalism that white men, as the rulers of colonial and apartheid South Africa, also showed to black people. Fanon talks about colonialism as a systematic negation of the other person and a furious determination to deny the other person all attributes of humanity. Now, at the heart of this lies a racialized masculinity. And this racialized masculinity holds the white masculine up as the dominant norm of being human. And we have to ask ourselves, to what extent have we actually dismantled this masculinity? Are we seeing a further hegemonization of this masculinity, or are we seeing even a deracialization? I think that the incredible levels of violence that we see in our society have to do with a dislocation and an attempt to reassert.
I worry sometimes that we have this sense of nostalgia about there was a better time, right? And maybe I'm not old enough to remember that better time. But I grew up in Soweto, and I experienced worse violence than what I see today. Mm-hmm. As a woman, I feel much safer in 2012, being able to navigate the world and challenge things and feel like I have recourse when things don't go the way I expect them to.